Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Abarca with Andy Lipson. Where's my mint? But all right. So I want to remind everyone that this episode and all previous episodes can be found on our site, which we can list down and comments below. On iTunes, Google Play, BitChute, Stitcher, and YouTube. And always, once again, thank you for listening and rating, reviewing, subscribing, and best of all, for sharing, which really helps us a lot. Okay, I really feel like I need a mint because I ate some garlic, but unless you don't matter,
no,
you don't care.
We're going for it.
Okay.
Bad breath and all.
I had to have some food before coming.
Yeah, well, it's Thanksgiving, come on.
All right. First off, I just want to quickly point and say, because I did see the rally that happened on 24th and Mission, so I want to just give out a shout out to all and be thankful for all the organizers that did organize it. It was supposed to happen today. So many coalitions were organizing in San Diego, and we're part of the a movement to create awareness and solidarity for the caravan that is happening, that people have been traveling for more than 2,000 miles across my country in Mexico, and we're standing in solidarity, as we have mentioned in a previous episode as well, that you can find. It's called The Caravan, and where we discuss why we stand with immigrants and actually stand for open borders, and we go in detail about that. But they should be granted asylum and they should come to this country. And also, one of our mutual friends has been asking if we can host or house some anyone that is in San Francisco Bay Area, some of the refugees. They would like for some contact information to see if they could just at least for 2 weeks. No need for expenses or anything like that, but okay. Yeah. So they're coming from the Central American caravans. I stand with them, and so we're going to discuss today something related to immigration, I think, because it should be discussed about. All right, what is it that we're going to be talking about? Amongst the many things that I find weird in this country, besides putting caps backwards on and eating contests.
Caps backwards? Oh, yeah, right. Baseball caps. Right?
Yeah. Okay. The celebratory of this celebration, this holiday, different from, like, because we also had settlers in Mexico, and there were alliances between Native Americans. We're talking about Thanksgiving, by the way. The topic is Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving myth. Different from, we had settlers, Spanish settlers, and here up north, here in this country, there's English settlers, starting in 1620 in Plymouth, no? But different from the way the cultural, I think the difference is I like to compare because it's just like a different perspective. Like, different from my cultural background is that there were alliances in Mexico between Native Americans and Spanish settlers, but the history is overwhelming about the more negative consequences of the settlement than you can praise for the settlements coming here and making alliances with Native Americans. There is no holiday. There is an observance day in Mexico, but there isn't a holiday like there is here, where you largely whitewash, sanitize the settler period into this country, which even the 1620 was when they came into the Plymouth, but it was like a year later when they had this Thanksgiving celebration festivity. But that is the what do you call it? That is the surrounding focus point of the settlers coming in, and everything else is like cultural genocide and real, like, massive genocide of Native Americans and wiping out of Native peoples and taking them out of their lands. That has been largely ignored by having this massive holiday being in concentration of all our wealth being poured into, or our capitalist economy being poured into this specific week. And, because the following day after Thanksgiving is Black Friday, and then now we have Cyber Monday, which, is like it's just adding more to this holiday spirit of the Hallmark spirit.
Really, we had Kmart Wednesday because Kmart had their specials. Maybe it was Walmart Wednesday because they started their Black Friday on Wednesday.
Yeah, it's just different in culture is what I'm trying to point out in how my country largely is resentful for the Spanish settlement, even though we had very similar. And here in this country is somehow, I don't know. I mean, there are reasons why we can point out, but it's just different. I feel it that way.
Yeah.
And coming here and seeing that the Puritans and
Puritans, yeah, the pilgrims and whatever.
Okay, Puritans and the pilgrims and all the people that came here to this country is largely like seen as like we welcomed, the Native Americans welcomed. Yeah. This is the week that you are celebrating all the welcoming of refugee religious people being persecuted and running. Not all of them were, by the way, but a lot of times this is the history that is surrounding around this, where you have people coming to this country from England because they were being persecuted for their religious background, being persecuted for who they were as a people, right, their identification. And here we have people having this racist backlash against refugees that are coming from the south, or in Europe coming from, again, the south to the north. And it is like...
Right, so let's spell it out here.
Yeah.
We're talking about a celebration, Thanksgiving celebration, of immigrants coming from Europe who are welcomed by the native population and are helped by the native population. And this whole holiday is built around this story of cooperation, this day of cooperation, of welcoming these immigrants and helping them out because they were having a tough time. They had a tough time in their own country, and they were having a tough time surviving in a very difficult climate. So this is our Thanksgiving story in the context of, migrant caravans being demonized and being told you can't come in here, on top of the already problem of the notion that the story of the incoming Europeans and the Native Americans is a story of cooperation. It was not a story of cooperation. It was the opposite of that. It was a story of genocide.
There was a resistance movement, and I think that what is largely is being concentrated is just this. Oh well, let's just talk about this piece where people were together. So that is the context from which we will be speaking from this video, and I'm a little pumped from having seen the rally, so I'm just trying to make the connections to current affairs, and hopefully you will also have some things that you wanted to bring up about how Native Americans, largely in this country, have been ignored, have been neglected, have been politically ostracized, or however you want to make that connection. And so maybe that's where I'm trying to get us. I don't know if you want to discuss something that you have, or I can.
Well, I guess the first thing I'll say is that I'll say if
and you wanted to say quickly. I want to say don't forget also to bring up the retribution. What do you call it?
Reparations.
Reparation.
Yeah,
at some point.
Okay. Is that the thing to understand in some ways about all holidays in the United States, virtually all holidays, is the difference between is how empty they are ultimately, all of them, of content in terms of how we celebrate them. Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday. It is the one that I...
Maybe we can start there. Because I didn't grow up celebrating.
It's the one that actually doesn't have all the... It doesn't... in the past it hasn't. It doesn't, at least for me and for my family and for people who I visited my partner's family. It's not as much about presents and money and things like that, although obviously it has become the kickoff to a commercial Super Bowl, which is Christmas. That's where most businesses make all their money, so that's what Thanksgiving has become. That's what it is under capitalism. It's completely just an economic, it's partly an economic thing. But I think for most people who enjoy the holiday of Thanksgiving and know that there is a deep lie at the center of it, that the story of cooperation is a complete, it happened, but it is not actually the story of what happened between the people of the European settlers, the immigrants who came in, and the Native Americans who were seen here. Most everyone recognizes that went down a very different way and was a story about lies, about violence, about destruction, about colonization, about imperialism, about torture. And I'm going to talk about a few things I actually additionally learned. And it's about resettlement. And ultimately, it is a story. It's a genocide story. It's essentially the Nazi genocide story where the Nazis won. But they weren't Nazis, they were the US state. And Napoleon has an important quote that says, victors get to write history. And this is what happens when the victors of a genocide get to write the history. They get to decide how it gets celebrated and how it gets framed. But the fact is most all of us, I think most of us know that there's this thing behind us. So you have I'll give you an example. There's a Jewish holiday, the Seder, which is celebrated, it's an actual holiday that celebrates it memorializes and speaks about the Jews being kicked out of Egypt and has all these different symbols of that moment. And during that holiday, you have a feast which has all these different elements that's supposed to denote parts of what happened to the Jews during that time. We don't do that during Thanksgiving. We don't sit down at Thanksgiving and talk about the past of this country. We don't do that. And if we did do that, it would be a very unpleasant conversation. Some people might try to avoid that, but there's no denying that past. So we just don't talk about it. What we do is we kind of almost put on blinders and just talk about family and talk about, sometimes we say, what are we thankful for, right? Well we've kind of tried to turn this holiday into something else. But nevertheless, this is a national holiday. It is something that the capitalist nation of the United States tries to use to say we are all celebrating this. We are all in the United States bound under this common tradition. It's a common tradition that has a lie deep at the heart of it. But you get a day off, you get a week off, and you just kind of let's not talk about that. That's really how people deal with this, and they enjoy the time off, and they enjoy the time with their family, and honestly, they don't generally want to be reminded about what a deep, bitter lie is not just at the heart of this holiday, but pretty much virtually every holiday. You go from July 4th to Christmas, even to Labor Day. We don't even talk about what that really is about. Veterans Day. Veterans Day is not about celebrating the defense of our country. What wars of defense are we talking about? Maybe it's one back in 1812 when England was coming and invading in Washington, D.C. and Louisiana or something like that. No, I mean, Veterans Day is a celebration of ultimately our memorialization of the various occupations and foreign wars we've put on other countries. It's a continuation of the story of Thanksgiving, which is a story about, it's a cover for an imperialist adventure within the United States to colonize this land, and now Veterans Day is in some ways a continuation of that, but abroad. How do we colonize the rest of these territories? Ultimately for the same reasons, for gold, for profits, for land, for resources. That's what this all went down for that. So there's a real problem for those of us who celebrate these holidays, is that we have to kind of ignore all that in order to make it something meaningful. But nevertheless, our holidays are devoid. We don't really have a ritual that binds us that has any real meaning to us. But at the same time, these holidays do perform the role of trying to corral everyone under a common national identity. So whether we like it or not, there's the lie of Thanksgiving, and then there's the lie that we are all one in celebrating such a day. And I just want to say that's a feature of what's happening here.
Thank you for that. Andy, I was going to ask you a question actually in your speaking. What was the education, or what was the celebration like for you growing up in public education for you? What was the story around this holiday?
Well, definitely when I grew up, in the elementary school and maybe middle school, there was this thing about Native Americans and pilgrims getting together and cooperating. And we would talk about that as if that was the story of that time. So as a young person, we weren't told, or I was not told, that there was a deep violent heart underneath all this. Later in high school, you started to hear about things like Manifest Destiny, and you were like, I never quite put two and two together. But then you just hear, wasn't really cooperation. There was something else going on, but we kind of had to because Manifest Destiny. And then there was various levels of a soft critique you would hear, but you know, it was just like, well, you know, we all know that's what we want. That's what we would have. Thanksgiving is what we would have wanted. How we would have wanted history to go down, but unfortunately, it didn't go down that way. So here we are. You know, it's kind of. I think it was sold like that.
Mm-hmm. The reason why I ask is because I'm wondering if there has been a difference from how your education, because you work in a high school now, so if there is a difference from how the history is taught around around Thanksgiving from the time that you were in school to today. I'm not sure.
I don't know. I know my school deals with it differently. We didn't have like Columbus Day being Indigenous Peoples Day kind of thing, and I think there wasn't that. I think there's a much deeper questioning with ethnic studies and things like that being taught in our school of the Columbus myth of this person finding the United States, of the fact that this was we are particularly under the context of immigration, and where like my school has many people who are immigrants. A lot of us are opposed to these attacks that are going on immigrants, and they are opposed to trying to make teachers, you know, essentially border guards, you know, in various forms for public education. Then we also recoil at this notion, like we highlight the hypocrisy of this period of time of Thanksgiving being this time where we celebrate these immigrants who are welcomed and helped, and then suddenly we're not doing the same thing, you know. So I do think, at least in San Francisco, in our public schools, I do think it's different. I wouldn't be able to speak to how it. I should ask my sister, who's in Cincinnati, how it's taught or how it's talked about there.
I find that there is, and I find that myself, I have seen more of this dramatic shift. I think more because of the rise of ethnic studies and the rise of more awareness around this holiday, and as well as Columbus Day you mentioned. And I think that these are positive like movements that are happening culturally, shifting the culture, and that is part of the reason why I had wanted to have this discussion with us here, because of mostly my exposure to when Alcatraz, how they had decided to I'm going to say a little bit about that, where Native Americans had decided to occupy it for a time after it was disoccupied from being used as a penitentiary.
Yeah, it was the prison.
Yeah, and there was a law that was in place, and I can link it. There was a law that was in place that was that if any unoccupied land in the USA was abandoned or was not used, that Native Americans could occupy it. They could just take it. And so so this island had been disoccupied for some time, and this happened around 1964. And so Native Americans had decided to go there and be like, well, let's occupy it. And along with other Native American students around the Bay Area and outside as well, but mostly the Bay Area, they had decided to take over this island and to set up encampment for themselves there for 19 months.
Right.
So I got inspired by hearing of this story, and I attended several and have continued to since when I'm in the country to continue honoring this legacy. And they have the sunrise ceremony happening in Alcatraz twice a year for the Columbus Day, which is now switched to Indigenous Peoples Day, and Thanksgiving holiday. And Thanksgiving is mostly sold out. It's like really packed, but that is what continues to happen after the occupation, and they were eventually, by the federal government, booted out, and they had to change, and it was a direct assault on Native Americans. But that is what the legacy continues, and I think Native American people continue to strive to figure out how to continue to have more be known and not be neglected, largely in this capitalistic country that has ignored health rights, services for them, and this I was mentioning this disappearance of women, Native American women, that I blanked out on the statistic earlier, but these are the things that I feel like are not largely talked about in Congress or in our government in general.
Yeah, I mean, Well, first off, that I want to say something about one thing that I didn't know about, because I think many of us here who listen to this are going to be familiar with the forcing of people, Trail of Tears, the forcing of Native American population to leave their land and be forced onto these reservations that were very difficult to live on. Mostly, they're in the center of the country, South Dakota, Nevada, and various reservations of these sorts. One thing I did not know about was not just the relocation of Native Americans, but the how their children were often taken. Like again, these in the time of people talking about children being taken from the border. Okay, and this is what our government is separating families. There was a forced separation of children from their families on a mass scale. Why these kids were put in boarding schools. Young Native American children were essentially Christian missions were formed with government money to create boarding schools, and those children were taken from their families and educated in a Euro-American way. Basically, we're not allowed to speak their language. If they did, they could be punished and they would be hurt. All sorts of torture, psychological torture, physical torture, to basically make it so that you would not speak your language, not do your dance, not wear any of your tribal clothing. They had to force gender roles that were more Euro-American because the women did not know their place or the girls tended to be more empowered essentially, and they had to teach girls that because they came from cultures that had an element of matriarchy to them in terms of how they were run. So they were being told, no, don't think like you're going to run things like your grandmother does. That's not how things work. And the other thing that was interesting about this is these assimilated Native Americans became part of the population that was then used to further degrade the conditions of the existing Native Americans in the reservations when they wanted to create new agreements, because they would get the assimilated Native Americans to be part of the group that would agree to these new conditions, which is how Native American situation has gotten worse and worse and worse. Okay, you're on a reservation, but you can make it communal lands. Oh no, you can't make it communal lands anymore, and we're going to put the Dawes Act, which basically says you can't even do communal lands anymore. It's going to be individual allotments that even non-Native workers or non-Native Americans can take some of that land. So by a series of written treaties, the United States was able to get the Native Americans to accept to climb down the ladder to this miserable situation they're in today. And often they got the people who would reach these agreements with weren't the people on that territory. They were people who had been taken from that territory, put in boarding schools, and then brought in as oh, these are your people, And that was an interesting fact to see how that was done. And there's a lot of bitterness from Native Americans in those places for what they often talk about. People talk of these people as almost half-breeds, people who aren't really part of the culture and who've been Americanized and are used to betray the cause of the Native Americans. So that was one thing that was new to me, and I didn't know about that. And the other thing is that, like you said, this is not just a genocide that happened in the past. First off, we're talking about what I think was estimated 10 million people. 10 million Native American people went down to a population of about 200,000 roughly at the turn of the century. By the turn of the 20th century, that's how many had been lost, right? I think those numbers have climbed again since that time, but we are talking about something, an order of a level of decimation larger than the Holocaust, all right? And let's be clear, these conditions have, when we talk about internment camps, this isn't something in the past. They exist right now. These reservations are internment camps that you can see in like Japanese internment camps or concentration camps that we put Jews in. That's what we have, a situation that has 80 to 85% poverty, 60 to 70% unemployment, 80% alcoholism, in terms of among men, a mortality, like what do they say? The life expectancy of Native peoples are like, for men it's like the age of 40, for women it's the age of 52, and that's like for average Americans it's like 71 for men, 80 for women, right? So obviously it's a completely different experience. So we don't have to talk about whether there will be a genocide in the United States. There has been one, and there continues to be one by not dealing with this crime that was committed on an entire population, a population that was not just executed and relocated, but they've been pushed to a point where their language is being lost, their culture is being lost. In the situation of the Lakota, who are from the Black Hills, only 14% of the population even speaks the Lakota language anymore, and most of them are 65 or older. And this is actually something the United States has pushed through their boarding schools past, but also by decimating these cultures and not letting them have a place to really thrive and grow. So it is. This is not a story from the past. This is a story of our present, and I just think that's important to remember.
To add to that as well, just we don't have to go far because we're located in San Francisco, California, not too far from here in the East Bay. There are shell mounds or ancestral burial grounds that are being built upon where Native Americans have tried to ask for the local government to not build onto these sacred grounds, and there are. You have Emeryville being built up by a large mall center, and people want to try to have these lands sacred and bury and their lands being
that is their. It is not tribe. That's their sacred lands. I mean, this is their religious. Respected. This is their religious territory, and it wasn't just there. It's all over It's all over these properties where essentially, people are rightly upset at what happened at Pittsburgh when Jews were killed in a synagogue, and what a desecration that is. People are rightly outraged, but let's be clear. That's nothing compared to the scale of what the United States has done and is currently doing with the Native American population and with the land that they saw as their land. The Black Hills, which is basically now a place for people to go and see great stones and stuff like that, like rocks and beautiful countryside. This is all territories that the Lakota saw as sacred lands for them and where their ancestors were. So it's like, and the U.S. just rolled right over that like a tank. And it didn't require fascism to do it. It just required the profit motive. That's important to understand, folks. Like if you're all upset about Trump and fascism, it's already here. Not fascism, but genocide. This conditions of genocide and the situation of genocide, the U.S. has done it kind of twice. African Americans and now Native Americans. So it's like we're not talking about what if. We're talking about here we go again. And that's just important to understand, is that this is not something just from our past. We are current, and this is why the question of reparations is a big one.
Yeah, you'd mentioned this last time.
I don't know if you want to say anything, but
no, you're the one who brought it up with me in our conversation before, and I think that I have looked into it, but not as deeply as I think maybe you have.
Just to say that the various reparations are subsidy or financial or material compensation for the theft of of a people's land or property or what have you, and then there's talk of reparations to blacks for the legacy of slavery, which it started back with fewer 40 acres and a mule. You'd get 40 acres and a mule, and I don't even know if people got that. And there's a similar talk about reparations, or there should be, for Native Americans. And there have been, some agreements reached, and it's important to understand that the money that most Native Americans get from the government is a result of some sort of agreement that the U.S. had around treaty about saying we get access to these minerals and we'll give you this money. So this is not a giveaway by the U.S. government. This is stuff that's already been taken from these people, and they're getting some form of it back in the form of some amount of money. Now the problem is that, and this is a big complaint among people who live in these territories, is a lot of that money doesn't actually come back to them. It's actually taken by these bureaucratic centers at the top, which are partly U.S. run, but also partly run by a set of what are often really crooked folks, some Native American folks, as you can imagine, who are basically skimming from the top. And this is how the U.S. has done it: is you find a group of Native Americans who are willing to play your crooked game, and you use them to basically enrich a group of people at the top, and this stuff doesn't trickle down. So there have been some agreements. In fact, in 2012, there was a multi-billion-dollar reparations deal reached with people who had had their property stolen, and thousands were supposed to get paid back. I don't know what the status of that was, but I've also seen a situation like, again, Lakota, who will not agree to any reparations. They just want they said, no, we're not agreeing to it because you can't make it right through some physical amount of money, millions or billions.
I was going to say that would be an argument.
We want our land back, And I think it's very important to, like, if there is ever going to be reparations, the people who will decide that reparations are working or are appropriate are the people who are actually affected directly. And that's going to be an important feature of it. And I don't know what it will look like, but I do think it's any future society, any socialist society any socialist revolution that takes place in the United States it's anything like calling itself legitimate is going to have to deal with this question. Is going to have to deal with that history that it's not necessarily respond to, but workers are going to have to attend to it. And if we don't, then I'm going to call bullshit on that revolution. Because it's part of our past, and Native American workers are going to be part of constructing a new world, and we cannot construct a new world by ignoring the world that got destroyed under capitalism, but nevertheless was destroyed. We're going to have to make that as right as we can make it, because some of these civilizations have been lost. Let's be clear. There's about 550 registered tribes. 200 of them are in Alaska. And supposedly hundreds of tribes are still trying to get recognition. But that doesn't speak to the tribes that have been lost. And all of them are most of them are desperate in terms of their economic situation, their physical situation, their health situation. And that's a situation the United States has put them in. And again, is another way in which it's how racism and the past intersect to create a horrible present for people. And that's what's happened for the Native Americans. It's the story of African Americans here in this country as well. So I guess I'll say that.
Yeah. Oh, that's a lot right there. That was pretty good. Hey, Andy.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you asked this.
Yeah.
Because I've been thinking a lot about this stuff.
Yeah. Where do I take it from there? I think it's important to. I was going to say something about how there are people that that are here in the USA that are going to make again that connection between Mexico and the USA. How their border really was not. There's so many native tribes in that gray zone border that they're not really. It was like the border crossed them rather than.
Yeah.
And so they're not, because it's part of where we are. It was part of Mexico.
Right.
So these Native American tribes and the native tribes down south were all in a different mindset on how they thought about the boundaries of this country. And that's why I think that if this was to happen, like the reparations, they should also be thinking about having open borders for this, for the country as a whole,
right,
alongside with that as well.
That's
because
right.
it is just it's another way of reparating, I think.
Yes.
Where you can have this country have down with the southern country, the southern border, because we're in the north. Sometimes I say the northern border, I myself, where it's a form of just taking away that handcuff of legacy that exists continues today, and that we continue to see this onto the people that exist on the border, that live on the border towns. So anyhow, I thought about that as when you said about reparations.
Yeah.
I personally also feel when I discuss this, it makes people uncomfortable. And one thing that you had said that I already can see someone saying, how do I fit this question in? Let's see. When you just said something about the Holocaust, and I think that is going to bring some very strong reactions to this. And some say that discrimination is discrimination. You shouldn't be comparing discrimination, or you shouldn't be comparing oppression. This is sometimes how I feel that this the stoppage to conversation about talking about why we have to look back at a certain group of how they have been oppressed in history, and how do we then, without undermining other people's struggles as well, how do we do you understand my question? I'm trying to form, like, how do we look at struggles and see, well, this group has experienced this struggle, and we have to look at that legacy, and we have to continue to try to find a way to, you will never be able to fix the past, but we can write a little bit of the past.
Well, it's going to have, I don't know if, I think your question is, so when we talk about this, like so in this case,
because people don't want to talk about reparations. The way people want to say is that happened in the past, let's forget it.
Right.
You know.
Well, I mean, the thing I would say is, if you don't deal with reparations, then you don't deal with justice. And if you don't deal with justice, then then you ultimately don't deal with a society which can work for people. Like, that's, capitalism doesn't want to deal with reparations. I totally get that. But if socialism doesn't want to deal with reparations, then it's no good. Then it's crap, because reparations are about making people whole as a result of all the damage that's been done by capitalism to different groups, right? The damage done to African Americans is different than it was to Native Americans, is different than it was to immigrants, is different than it was for white workers versus women versus male workers versus transgender. Everyone has been touched by capitalism in some way, shape, or form by something that has driven them down and told them that you are lesser. Revolution is part of everyone. Well, the people who have been oppressed they will have to come together. If it won't work unless they do come together, but it's part of them coming together and pushing against that and saying, no, I don't accept this secondary status. I want to be first among all my brothers and sisters who are part of this struggle. Well, for Native Americans to be first, we have to deal with that past. We can't just say, well, we had a revolution, but can you stay on your reservation in the desert in these places that have been, that are essentially uranium mines and poisoned water and all sorts of stuff? Like, no, that's not going to work. We're going to have to invite them into changing the world in a way where part of that change is part of making up for the mistakes that were made in the past. It's not because I made the mistake or you made the mistake, but these are our brothers and sisters. So how are we going to make them whole without addressing that mistake? So you can't. And if you can't offer them that, then you can't offer them any place in your movement. So
that's because the argument will be that I didn't do it.
Yeah, I didn't do it. But I have to be part of the solution. If I'm not part of the solution, then I am part of the problem. And if the solution's on offer, on a world no longer bound by profit, then that solution better include, if it doesn't include something for Native American workers, then they're right to look at me as a white worker, whatever worker, and be like, screw you and your revolution. And they'd be right to say that. So we have to provide something that makes them whole again, that allows them to speak their language, that allows them to do whatever they want to do in terms of their religion, their spiritual beliefs, and allows them to exist in the way they want to exist. Some of them actually do want to go back to the ways that they lived back in the day. And I think we should welcome that. And I think we should make every effort to have that be possible. I think it is possible. But we can't do it under the profit system. It will require revolution. That's why these people need to make a revolution with us. And one of the things that's a barrier to that is, like, when Standing Rock took place, there were some unions that took a position in support of Native American workers. But the union that was going to be dealing with the actual engineering and the building of the pipeline, that union's position was to actually say, hey, these people are attacking our pipeline workers, so we want the U.S. government to come in and take care of these folks, and not take care of them in terms of make their lives better, but put them in jail or defend workers, or do whatever it is to disperse people who are trying to stop these union workers who are engineers working on pipelines to do the dirty work of the U.S. state. Well, I'm sorry, those workers were on the wrong side of history and are on the wrong side of that question. And that union took the wrong position. And that's not going to work. It's the same way that unions think they're helping themselves by defending Democratic Party officials who try to put up border stuff, right? We're not helping ourselves with that, So it's working class will have to get clear about this stuff, or it will lose. That's what I'll say. that it will continue to be played in the same way that Native Americans got played back in the day, because that's what 1621 was a giant lie about the nature of the relationship between Euro-Americans and Native Americans. And unfortunately, Native Americans bought it, and they paid the price in blood and treasure and everything. And that's the same for the working class. We are being lied to constantly about the Democratic Party or somebody else who's going to help us in the capitalist class. And as long as we continue to see the capitalist class as something we can work with, and that we don't have to battle against, then we're going to get played in the same way that Native Americans got played. And that's, if you want to take a lesson from Thanksgiving, that's the lesson. Don't get played like the Native Americans by thinking that the Democratic Party or the capitalist class is your friend. They are your implacable enemy and must be treated in the way that Crazy Horse thought the Euro-Americans had to be treated. He was right, and there were plenty of Native Americans at the time who thought we could make peace with them or they were all wrong. They had to unite and fight like hell just to have a chance of surviving, and they weren't able to do that. That same situation exists for workers in this country, and we are under the same illusions, worse in fact, that we can peaceably change this country and make it something that works for all of us. That kumbaya myth is not. It's going to require a war. And the war is already being waged on us, just like the war was being waged on the Native Americans back in the day. They were just getting picked off side by side. We'll have peace with you on this little Pilgrim Day right on this front, but down in Florida, we're wiping you out. That's what was going on. Okay? So that's how we're getting picked off in the same way. And unless we get straight about that war, because the capitalists know what that war is, Euro-Americans knew what that war was, unless we get straight about it, then the same fate that has befallen the Native Americans is going to befall the entire working class, which we're going to be on the wrong side of history, and we're going to lose out, and it ain't going to look good.
Well, yeah. This is where I feel like I have to call out some BS when you're right, when you talked about the Democratic Party and what demands we have to make and what revolution we have to make. I agree, because when you talked about this, what came up for me was when Bernie Sanders was asked about reparations, he said we should not focus on that. We should focus on something else.
Sorry.
And so
that ain't socialist. I'm sorry. That's just
so this came up, this image, I remember the interview quite well, which I can post. He didn't say those exact words, but he just, when he was asked the question, he said, I'm not going, he just did not want to discuss the subject. So when you mention that, in the spirit of that, I think that I want to read just a little bit of a quote from this Native American who was invited to speak in 1970 that was censored. And I sent you the article, which we can link to. But for these listeners who are on commute right now or are listening to this in their kitchen, I think this will be really good before you look at the article itself. It was...
this is his speech.
Yeah, this is just a short. It's very short.
But he didn't speak it because it was taken out.
Yeah. This is in 1970. The Massachusetts Department of Commerce asked Wampanoags to select a speaker to mark the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' landing. Before Wamsuta Frank James could read his speech, though, it had to be approved by the people in charge of the ceremony. Here's what they decided not to allow him to read. And it's just this little. Okay, today is a time of celebrating for you. But it is not a time of celebrating for me. It is with heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn. Mas Asuit, the great leader of the Wampanoag, knew these facts. Yet he and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers. Before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoags and other Native Americans living near the settlers would be killed by their guns or dead from diseases that we caught from them. Although our way of life is almost gone and our language is almost extinct, we, the Wampanoag, still walk the lands of Massachusetts. What has happened cannot change, but today we work together towards a better America, a more Native American America where people and nature are once again more important. In response to the censorship, they decided to have protests and called Thanksgiving the National Day of Mourning, and this was in the morning in 2001. This is the most recent one. This is another one. James drew the connection between the resistance of Native Americans in the past and the struggles they face today. 2001. This is 30 years later, the day of the morning in 2001, after that speech. This one is, back in 1970s, those who started Day of Mourning spoke of terrible racism and poverty. Racism is still alive and well. Our people still are mired in the deepest poverty. We still lack decent health care, education, and housing. Every winter, thousands of our people have to make a bitter choice between heating and eating. Our youth suicide rates, our rates of alcoholism continue to be the highest in the nation. As the economy crumbles around us, these conditions will only worsen. Today we mourn the loss of millions of our ancestors and the devastation of our beautiful land and water and air. We pray for our people who have died during this past year. We join America in grieving for those who lost their lives at the World Trade Center, and I hope that you will join me. Remember, this is 2001, so this is when the World Trade... We join in grieving for those who lost their lives at the World Trade Center, and I hope that you will join me in grieving too for the immense suffering, because he did not ignore other nations as well, suffering of our sisters and brothers in Afghanistan, in Palestine, and Iraq, human beings who are referred to by the government as collateral damage. We remember all too well that our people throughout the Americas have for centuries been the collateral damage of the European invasion. The events of this past September were tragic and have affected all of us. Many innocent people lost their lives. We condemn all acts of violence and terrorism perpetuated by all governments and organizations against innocent civilians worldwide. And we condemn the racial profiling, the detentions that are being directed against our Arab, South Asian, and Muslim brothers, sisters in this country. But the events of September 11 were certainly not the first acts of terrorism to have occurred in this country. Since Columbus and the rest of the Europeans invaded our lands, Native people have been virtually non-stop victims of terrorism. I think of the slaughter of the Pequots of Mystic, Connecticut in 1637. I think of U.S. military massacres of peaceful Native people at Wounded Knee and Stand Creek, and so many, many other places. I think of the armed assault by the FBI on a peaceful encampment at Pine Ridge in the 1970s. I might as well just finish here.
Yeah.
This. In fact, the very foundation of this powerful, wealthy country are the theft of our lands and slaughter of Native peoples and the kidnapping and enslavement of our African American sisters and brothers. And the U.S.-assisted terrorism against Native peoples continues to this day in all too many countries in Central and South America. These are indeed difficult times, but our ancestors and our traditions will give us the strength that we need. Always we must remember that we shall endure. A handful of somehow managed to survive Columbus and the conquistadores and the pilgrims and the French and all other invaders. Beautiful native youth, he speaks to the youth. Remember what your ancestors went through to bring you here. We are like the dirt, like the sand, like the tide. We shall endure. The struggle will continue. In the spirit of Crazy Horse, what you had mentioned, in the spirit of Zapata, who was a revolutionary in Mexico, in my country, in the spirit of Matacom, in the spirit of Anama Aquash, in the spirit of Geronimo, we are not vanishing. We are not conquered. We are as strong as ever. So, I think of that speech 30 years later, after the 1970s in 2001, when, and the demands that you just said about just to overall the elite ruling class of this country, and I think that is the commemoration of what we should be looking at. Mm-hmm. As we also can celebrate Thanksgiving as a form of uniting together as family, but also not forgetting the past and really the significance of this holiday is.
I think the fact is that if we have a socialist revolution, all these things, all these holidays are gone. Christmas, they're all going. Right?
Don't say that, Andy. You'll lose alliance.
They're all going.
People don't want to.
July 4th, that's gone. Veterans Day, gone. Women's Day stays. Labor Day stays. Thanksgiving, gone. But if you were going to take a lesson from Thanksgiving, it would be that. It would be, do not get suckered don't get suckered by thinking your enemy is your friend. And when you do that, there are lives hang in the balance by getting that wrong. And the working class can learn a lot from the Native American experience in this country. Whether you're a Native American worker or an Irish worker or a Latino worker or black worker, there's a lot to learn.
We have to learn from the history and the lessons of Native American people. Unfortunately, things have continued. We have to learn.
And who was this quote by that you read?
That was that was in 2001. This was Muna Num.
Oh, Munama. Munanum James.
Munanum James. That was in 2001.
From what tribe?
I'm sorry, it doesn't say. I don't have it.
Okay, all right. Well, I will end with a quote of my own, not from Munanum or a Native American, but from Glenn Johnson, who is the business agent, business manager for the International Union of Operating Engineers. That union that took the wrong side on the stuff around Standing Rock. And here's what he had to say. And he got it exactly wrong. So here's what he said, because he got it exactly wrong in saying, he said the governor might have to call out the National Guard, and so we can get through this volatile area. It's appalling what's going on. He's absolutely right, but what he was appalled by was that workers aren't able to build this pipeline. And here's what he said. He said, unions have supported peaceful protest, and we do it ourselves. When it's violent is when the law needs to step in. What are we all supposed to be? Vigilantes and take the law into our hands? Well, yes. He got it exactly wrong about the working class. The working class needs to take the law into its own hands. It can't rely on the state. And that is the lesson of Thanksgiving. It's the opposite of what this guy Gary Johnson was saying, which is the working class must become a vigilante class, a class for itself, of itself, that recognizes that it's got to bring law to a lawless society, a lawless capitalist society. And if it does so, in a way that includes immigrants, includes Native Americans, includes blacks, women, transgenders, then we're going to have a very different society. And if we don't do that, then we do face extinction. And I think that's the lesson of Thanksgiving.
Well, what I thought was going to be 30 minutes ended up being...
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Gobble, gobble, gobble. All right, so we'll end it, I think, there, right? Yeah. If I may, sometimes I do this at the end. Just want to add this little tidbit that happened over the weekend, and then Monday was documented. There was Mexican protests against the Central Americans that have been arriving to Tijuana, which is a border town, one of the closest border town in Baja California, very close to San Diego. And the Mexicans have been rising up against them. And all I just want to say is, I almost wanted to curse here, but I won't. It's disgusting. It's horrible. It's appalling that my fellow Mexicans, I just call out their BS, have adopted the same racist rhetoric that this administration, this government really, has been using against Mexicans. And for Mexicans to be rising up against them and to be making them feel unwelcomed is not who I think Mexico is. It's not the heart of Mexico. It is not who I make sure that I'm part of the larger movement of Mexicans that do not believe in this racist, divisive rhetoric and protests around Central Americans. And I think we should all welcome them. And so I just wanted to say, because it was documented this week, I'm just not okay with it. I'm not all right with that, and I accept all refugees from everywhere, and even our country should do better ways, and it should not be incited and instigated by political leaders like the mayor of Tijuana. So that's all I want to say about that. Thank you very much for listening to my little rant, because I had to let that out as well. Okay. There will be continue to be rallies after today as well, in solidarity for the caravan. So that's all.
And it's something we might have to talk later about, helping people who need to be hosted.
Yes, we have to. Let's get more information about that. But our mutual friend has been asking about it. Sent me a text message, and I think that if anyone is interested in supporting, I personally I have a very small space here.
We should talk about it offline.
Yeah. Okay.
But that is something. Is there stuff that we can send out that's a link if people are interested, or not really?
Yeah, we can send out.
We'll see.
We'll get some information if we can.
Stuff,
Yeah.
All
and
right.
one other thing I wanted to ask you is, what topic are we going to discuss?
I am not sure. Next week, right?
Yeah.
next week. Did you have an idea?
No, that's at the end. You always ask me, and I
I know.
realized you never. You didn't
Yeah.
ask me this time.
I didn't because I'm like clueless.
Maybe we'll have an interview. I have someone.
If you have somebody to interview, then maybe
Okay.
we can pull it together by then. I would try that, and we'll try to figure out the sound for that as well.
All right. All right.
So we'll talk about that.
Okay.
So we don't know what we're doing next week, but we'll have
surprise
something
you.
next week. Yes, exactly. Well, that'll be like our 30th episode.
Wow.
We've already had 28. It'll be 29, and it'll be 30th episode. So
Wow.
We've done well.
Yeah. Thank
right.
you, Andy.
Happy
I
Thanksgiving.
appreciate you.
I
Yeah.
appreciate you too. I've done a good job. Keeps me honest.
Please subscribe, please share, please rate, and make sure that you can find us on iTunes, BitChute, Stitcher, Google Play, or YouTube. Thank you very much.
All right. See you next week.
Ciao.